Hi guys! Today we're going to go over all the books that I read in June. Is it halfway through July right now? Maybe, but if you've watched some of my more recent videos, you know my life's gotten a little weird lately and I've been really busy. I did read a lot in June. I had the first week off for vacation and it was just kind of a staycation, so I ended up reading a ton that week. And then I do have one book that was more of a May rollover and one book that was kind of a July rollover, but I'm just going to talk about them all and you'll see why. So this is my May rollover, but I haven't talked about it yet, and that is Dreams of Gods and Monsters by Laini Taylor. This is the third and final book in the Daughter of Smoke and Bone trilogy, and it was probably my least favorite one so far. I do think her writing is exceptional as always, and I really love the characters in this. I just thought this one really suffered major pacing problems. The second book leaves off on like such a cliffhanger, and I liked the first chunk of this book, but it seemed to introduce kind of a totally new element as we were going further into this book, and I just didn't think, even though this is the longest book in the series, that it had the time to address that plot element properly. It kind of seemed like she was kind of opening a possibility for another series, but so far it hasn't been written, so she does kind of have a multiverse thing happening with her books, so I'm curious to see if her next one kind of ties some things together. But overall, I did really enjoy this series as a whole. I think it probably averages out to about 4 stars for me, and I think it's absolutely worth a read. This one just wasn't my favorite. Then I picked up Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmis. This is a very hyped book. It was the Good Morning America book club pick when it came out. It was the Barnes & Noble book pick of last year. I think it won a Goodreads award for general fiction. So I was definitely going into this knowing that there was a lot of hype and I wasn't sure if it was going to live up to that, but I quite enjoyed this. This isn't my go-to genre. I do like historical fiction, but it's not something I gravitate towards a lot. It's something I have to be in the mood for. I did quite like the setting of this. It takes place in the 60s and we follow a woman who works in STEM, and she's not very respected by her coworkers or her bosses even. She's not taken seriously and this really frustrates her. Overall, I did quite like this book. It wasn't what I thought it was going to be, but I didn't necessarily mind that. I do think the bright kind of beach read vibe of the cover is very misleading. This book tackles some really serious issues, feminism, misogyny, and like there's death and grief and stuff like that, and she struggles a lot in this book, and it's really hard to read about in certain parts. So if that's something you're sensitive to, don't be fooled by the bright pink cover. I think if I had known exactly what this was going to be about, I probably wouldn't have picked it up, but I'm glad that I did ultimately. And I do think it'll make a good TV show. I think it's Apple is doing a show or a miniseries starring Brie Larson, so I think that'll be cool, and I think she's well cast, so I'm curious to see how that turns out, and I gave this a 4 star. I've been trying to request arcs lately that I know are going to be Fairy Loot picks in a couple of months, so I can kind of stay up to date on them, or even, read them before I get them, so I know if it's an edition that I'm going to want to keep or sell or even skip. I did read 2 this month. The first one was Shanghai Immortal by A.Y. Chow, and this is a book that takes place in the 20s in Shanghai, but not the Shanghai we know. It's sort of like the hell version of Shanghai, and we follow a main character who is half fox demon and half vampire. So even within her own community, she's kind of a bit of an outcast because vampires aren't really something that's seen often in this society or in this part of the world, and the court of fox demons thinks that she's basically like a feral animal. Like the way that she acts is not proper and not befitting of a young lady, but she doesn't really care. Her adoptive father is sort of the king of hell, so she has a bit of leeway to kind of do what she wants. She does face more scrutiny when she gets in trouble because of her position, but it made for an interesting dynamic. I will say, I think not a lot of people are going to like this book, not because it's written poorly or anything, but the main character is really difficult to connect with. She's almost 100 years old, but she acts like a petulant child, and makes fart jokes and stuff, which the latter bit doesn't bother me quite so much, but just her general attitude is kind of a lot, and I did ultimately like where this story is going. I think I'll probably pick up the next one, but it took a really long time for me to fall in love with this main character and fall in love with this story. A huge draw to this story for me was the fact that it takes place in the 20s in Shanghai, but I feel like we just didn't get a whole lot of like the feeling of that era, which it kind of feels like that's the whole reason you said it during that time period, is for that vibe. And I had the same problem with these Violent Delights. It takes place in the same time period, but like for me it just didn't feel like how I wanted it to feel. Like it didn't feel like the writing emulated that period very well. There is a scene where they go dancing, and I thought that was kind of the most like 20s vibe of the whole thing. But otherwise, yeah, I don't know. This was an interesting debut. I gave it 3 stars. I'm not in love with it, but I think it introduced enough intriguing elements by the end that like I want to see where it goes. So I don't think this will be for everybody, but I had a fun time with it. Then I read an arc of The Curse of Saints by Kate Dramis. This was another Fairy Loot pick, and I did not like this one. I gave this 2 stars. I thought this felt so generic YA. It takes a lot of familiar things from more popular stories, like the whole sainthood thing and like the different types of magic workers. It felt very like Grisha-verse to me, like almost overly so. And also like our main character is kind of like the most generic badass edgy assassin character that like doesn't really do anything to back up the claims that both the writing and her like she herself make about who she is and what she does. So like that was really disappointing. And like the world building felt really confused to me. Again, sort of generic fantasy, but then there's plumbing. The outfits are described like as very like she's wearing sweaters and pants all the time, and I'm like, and I just had a very hard time visualizing it, like what this setting in this world was supposed to look like. There's also this like wolf companion element thing that is introduced in the very beginning and very quickly dropped. The main characters go off to another continent for the rest of the book, and it's like just never addressed again, and I'm just like, what was the point of that? So I don't know, this felt like it just borrowed a lot of stuff from popular YA series and kind of failed to make it its own. I will not be continuing this series. I really only finished it because I wanted to know there's like a reason why her and the love interest don't jive. And I wanted to know why that was. So it's teased throughout, and it was like just compelling enough to keep me going. But ultimately, I just thought this was, again, I've said it like 3 times now, super generic and nothing really special or unique about it. The writing itself wasn't very good. The love interest is also super like resand coded, so like I said, just borrowing from really popular series. So I'm really sad because this edition is super pretty, but I don't think I'm gonna hold on to it, and yeah, I'm not gonna continue this series. Then I picked up Last Night at the Telegraph Club by Melinda Lowe. This is a YA historical fiction, and we follow a girl who's from Chinatown. Her and her best friend are kind of starting to fight. There's issues regarding McCarthyism and like the whole Red Scare thing going on, and it's directly affecting her family. She becomes friends with another girl in her class who introduces her to the Telegraph Club, and she starts to feel things stir within her that makes her realize that she's a little different than a lot of the girls in her class, and sort of what that means and what that looks like in the I keep saying 50s. Yeah, 50s. Okay. So yeah, this was really good. I thought this really emulated the time period very well. And the setting and stuff was really intriguing. And I felt like, you know, in it. So I really liked the writing. I will say there was some chapters that kind of switch perspectives throughout this book that I don't really think added a whole lot, or like it felt like it was culminating to something that just never really happened. I don't know if I was reading into it incorrectly or what, but I don't know if those chapters did a whole lot for me. So I really enjoyed our main character Lily though, and her whole story and her coming out sort of experience was really, I don't want to say interesting because she was going through it, but it was really touching to read about. So I gave this a 3.5 out of 5 star. I also picked up Winter's Orbit by Everina Maxwell, and this is a standalone sci-fi romance story that's actually a lot more political than I was expecting. The main plot revolves around this arranged political marriage. There's a member of the royal family who basically gets told he needs to marry this ambassador to another planet, but that ambassador was married to our other main character's cousin for quite some time, and so it just feels like very sudden after his cousin dies that he's getting married off to this guy, and that's kind of confusing, sorry, but there's a lot of questions as to like, why is this happening so quickly? There's this big political event that's about to happen that's super important, and as these two characters get to know one another better, even though they're married, there's a lot of stuff to wade through, especially in one of the characters' past, and it was a little frustrating because a lot of their problems kind of felt like if y'all just talked for a hot second, you'd figure out what the heck is happening here. There's a lot of assumptions made about one another's behavior that leads to some tension, and so I think that might annoy some readers, but I thought it worked and it made sense. I did quite like the political aspect of this story, and it felt like very gentle sci-fi. Like, for the most part, I didn't have any trouble with the technology or any of the jargon or anything, and I'm kind of a sci-fi noob, so take that how you will. There were some very frustrating decisions made about who certain characters trusted with certain information. I was reading it just kind of screaming, like, why would you tell this person that? It was fun. There was a good political kind of thriller thing happening alongside this arranged marriage romance, so lots of tropes in there if you like that sort of thing. I wouldn't pick this up if you're just looking for a romance, because there's a lot more happening here, but I thought this was really interesting. I appreciated that it was a standalone. This does kind of have a soft sequel that takes place in the same universe, but it's not about the same characters, so the plot in this book begins and ends with this one book, so if that's something that appeals to you, just know that. But I also gave this one a 3.5 out of 5 stars, and I think I'm gonna pick up the second one, because I liked this world and I liked Everina Maxwell's writing. This next one is a new release that I picked up pretty much as soon as it came out, and I didn't want to wait too long before I read it because I felt like the entire internet was reading it, and that is Yellowface by R.F. Kuang. This is R.F. Kuang's first sort of contemporary non-fantasy book, and I was really intrigued to see how that went. I read and quite enjoyed the Poppy War series. I still need to get to Babel. It's on my list. But I wanted to tackle this one where it's a contemporary. It felt like it'd be a fast read. It's very short, and it was intense. It packs a punch for, 300 and something pages. The story follows Juniper Song, who witnesses her sort of frenemy, Athena Liu, die in this horrible accident, and they're both writers, but Athena has seen a lot more success in her career, and it's something that June has always sort of resented about Athena. After Athena dies, June finds her unfinished manuscript for her new book and decides to workshop it a bit, add some stuff, do some editing, and publish it as her own. It seems like she's maybe well-intentioned in the beginning, but it quickly devolves into just some of the worst, most toxic, awful, horrible behavior I've ever read about. The victim complex that Juniper has is so intense. The story that she steals is also just very inherently about, like, Chinese culture during a certain period of time, and like, she does not for 1 second consider whether or not this is her story to tell, and it's a lot. So the first 2/3 of this are kind of like a train wreck. You can't look away. It's gonna get horrible and dramatic. It's like, I don't want to compare it to trashy TV, because R.F. Kuang's writing is definitely like way above that, but like the events of this book feel like a reality show in like the most compulsive way possible. But by the 2/3 mark, I do think I got kind of fatigued with June's behavior. It just got increasingly more difficult to read about the more she sort of descends into like just her horrible behavior. And at a certain point, I just wanted it to be done because June was so awful. And I do think, again, that is a testament to R.F. Kuang's character work and her writing. She hooks you in even though our main character is so massively unlikable. You can't stop reading it. So, again, I don't want to say I enjoyed this, because it's about really widespread issues in publishing, and it's horrible that that's the reality of this atmosphere, but this was very compulsively readable. I haven't read a bad R of Kwong book yet, and I really enjoyed this, so I gave it 4 stars. Then after reading that kind of heavy thing, and also real life getting kind of heavy, I wanted to pick up something that was just gonna be like a snack for my brain, something I didn't have to think too hard about, something that was gonna be really fun, and I've heard really great things about Carissa Broadbent, so I wanted to pick up Serpent and the Wings of Night, which is a vampire fantasy romance series. This is the first one in a duology that is part of a larger series of like 6 books, I think, that all take place in the same world. And this was a ton of fun. Our main character, Araya, is a human, but she's adopted by a vampire king of like, I think it's the Nightborn vampire king. There's 3 kingdoms within this world of vampires, and the Nightborn kingdom is one of them. So she's kind of in this weird position where she's connected to someone very powerful, but as a human in a court of vampires, she's very vulnerable. So she's had to learn how to defend herself, how to, take on vampires specifically. And at the beginning of this, she enters a competition in which the winner gets to basically ask a favor from their god, Nyaxia. She again, is the only human in this competition, so she's extra vulnerable and has to be on her guard pretty much all the time. But then she runs into this guy named Rain, who is a vampire of their court, but like of a different kind of race of vampires. There's some political tension in here happening that is a little messy. Rain intrigues her and frustrates her, and she doesn't trust him at first, but they're kind of forced to work together in this competition, and it's a romance, so feelings ensue, and this was so much fun. I flew through this. I think it took me 2 or 3 days to read this, and it's like 500 pages. So then I picked up the second book, which I'm not going to get too deeply into because obviously it would heavily spoil the first book, but this one did take me a little bit longer. I thought the pacing was a lot slower, and where it didn't have that competition element, I wasn't quite so much like, oh my god, what's going to happen? It felt a little repetitive with some of the things the main character was going through and some of her feelings and stuff, but it was still fun and I still enjoyed it. I think I gave this one 4 stars and I gave this one 3 stars. And I also read the novella that is out that exists in the same world. And I read this one between books 1 and 2, and I do highly recommend that. It's not required reading, but you do get the background on a character that is introduced in book 2 and their sort of romance. And I really quite enjoyed that, as well as the love interest in this book. So I gave this one a 4-star rating as well, and it was a super quick read. I think I read it in like 1 sitting. So I read all these in like a fever dream. I think it was like a week, not even. But this was a lot of fun. I think Tor just picked up the series, not the novella, but the first 2 will be republished at the end of the year, and I think they put out the new cover for the first one. It looks quite similar, but I think that's awesome for Carissa Broadbent, and this is a very addictive series, so I can see why it's getting so much hype. I've had this book for 2 years, and I keep going, I'm gonna read it in June, and I hadn't. But finally, I read 7 Days in June by Tia Williams, and this was a lot funnier than I expected it to be. The only thing I knew going into this was it was a second chance romance between 2 adults who connected when they were younger, and they're both writers, and they sort of write about each other in one another's works. As they're older, like I said, they reconnect, and it's just as intense as the first time they met, and they have a lot of issues to work out, but it was so lovely to watch them work those out. I really loved this. Tia Williams is an excellent writer. Her dialogue was so good, and it felt like really real. Like, she has a very good sense of how people actually talk, which I feel like sounds silly, but is a skill that I think is a little underrated. Again, just the dynamic between not just the main character and the love interest, but like between the main character and her own daughter and her friends and stuff was just so funny. I was like laughing out loud at this book. And again, I thought this was going to be a very intense, dramatic romance. So I really appreciated it. There were moments of levity, and it felt very well balanced. It felt like a snippet of someone's actual life. I gave this book 4 stars. I want to go read, I think she's got another book that's been out for a while that just got a Netflix adaptation, so I want to read that as well. And I think she's got another book coming out next year that's like a historical romance, so I think that sounds cool, and I'm so glad I finally read this. Oh my gosh, the internet was not lying. It was very good, and the romance was very touching, so 4 stars, and I can't wait to see what she does next. Then I picked up the next Murderbot book, which is Rogue Protocol. This is the 3rd one, and I have very consistent feelings about this series as a whole. It's always a fun romp. I like our main character, Murderbot, a lot. The situations they find themselves in is always sort of entertaining to read about. They encounter a lot of other funny robots that I always end up falling in love with, and the one that was introduced in this one was no different. And I can't get too much into it because it would spoil the previous installments, but I give this one like a 3.5 out of 5. Not the strongest in the series, I don't think, but I can see where they're going with it, and I am enjoying that journey. I want to read all of these. You know, I think Murderbot is such a great character, and Martha Wells really captures this character type very well. So these are just really fun, and I look forward to reading them every month. Then the last book I read in June was Seven Faceless Saints by M.K. Lobb. This is another Fairy Loot edition, and I don't know, books about saints just weren't really doing it for me this month. This one at least had atmosphere, unlike The Curse of Saints. I could see where they were going with this. It has kind of an Italian-inspired vibe. There are these gods, or saints rather, that give their descendants powers. So the magic system was kind of interesting. It was still that kind of like segmented magic system, but it made a little more sense to me. And our main character is a badass with a knife who wants revenge, and it's a second chance romance between her and her childhood friend who betrayed her. I don't know, I don't really have much to say about this. It was fine. It didn't do a whole lot for me. I thought the murder mystery was incredibly underwhelming. I knew who it was almost immediately. Like, I think by their second scene, I was like, that's the murderer. And so that was kind of frustrating because I wasn't even like trying to puzzle out who it was. It was just so obvious to me, and I kept waiting for there to be a twist because it felt too obvious, but alas, that's not how it worked out. I don't think I'm going to continue this series either. It's not super compelling to me. It's a very quick little read. It's a tiny book. The size is super weird, but I don't know. I didn't love it like I wanted to, and that's really all I have to say about it. I think I gave it 3 stars. So those are all the novels that I read. I do briefly want to go over some of the manga that I read in case you're interested. If you watched my last wrap up, then you'll know I fell in love with Fiona of the Dawn recently, and I pretty much caught up entirely in June. I think I was on volume 24 and I read all the way through volume 38 in June. While I was on vacation, I just kept borrowing them from the library. I am slowly trying to collect them, so I think I have like volumes 1 through 6 and now 35 through 38. I gotta fill in the gaps at this point, but I'm trying to wait until I find them for a good deal because there are so many of them, and at $10 a pop, you know, that's $380 for the whole series. So trying to buy them slowly. I mostly read them from the library digitally, so that was a lot more accessible for me, and I have so much fun. All of the arcs in this series have been excellent so far. I think it does political fantasy romance really well. If you don't know or haven't seen my previous videos where I talk about this series, we follow in a princess in exile named Fiona after a political coup and her bodyguard Hawk. Their crew kind of grows, and I don't want to say why because that's kind of a spoiler, but all the characters are just so amazing. I love them all dearly, and I just think the whole group dynamic is great, but then like the bodyguard romance between her and Hawk is also excellent, if that's a trope that you really like. And yeah, again, like I think the politics are handled really well as well. They're compelling. There's always like this really strong moral thing happening as well, and Fiona just feels like, you know, such an awesome warrior. She grows so much in this series, from like spoiled princess to competent archer leader, and it's so good to watch. I think this is probably my favorite manga series at the moment. It's like up there with Spy Family, but there's just obviously a lot more of this, so it's such a treat. I wish they'd come out with the season 2 of the anime, because I've already binged and loved the first season, and I can't wait for the next volume to come out because I'm all caught up now and I'm sad. So these are all pretty much consistently 4 or 5 stars, and I love this series and I highly recommend that you read them. Then we had a couple new releases. Volume 6 of A Sign of Affection came out, so I picked that up and pretty much read it right away. This is a super cute romance with, it follows college students, not just high school students, which is something I think you see in shoujo manga a lot, especially. It's just so soft and cute. Our main character is deaf, so she uses sign language, and the love interest is kind of a world traveler, and he likes to learn a lot of languages, and when he initially meets her, he is very intrigued by her and tries to learn sign language in order to communicate with her, and then they just have the softest, cutest little romance, and I love it. This is not the most plot-forward series, but it does make me feel soft and warm and fuzzy inside, and for that I gave it a 4-star rating, and I think an anime just got announced for this. I think it's coming out next year, and I'm very much looking forward to it, because I think, especially with the sign language element, that will work really well, so I'm excited. Then My Happy Marriage Volume 3 also recently came out, and this is sort of a Cinderella retelling. Our main character is raised in a family that actively treats her like trash, and she gets engaged to a guy that they think is pretty much gonna throw her out on the street, but he doesn't, and he turns out to be this really wonderful, awesome person, and they actually start to develop feelings, but there's still a lot of tension between her and her family, and also some political magical stuff happening as well. The romance is really touching, and it's a bright spot in an otherwise very bleak story. The anime, I think, just started to come out on Netflix at the beginning of July, so I gotta watch that, but overall, this is a very solid series, and I gave this 4 stars. And that wraps up my June plus a little extra reading. I'm so sorry that this is coming out so late and that I've been a little more inconsistent with uploads. Like I said earlier, my life is getting a little crazy and will probably remain so for the rest of the year. So I apologize that my volume of videos has been kind of a little less than normal, but thank you guys for watching. I do really appreciate it, and YouTube is something I have a lot of fun with. I love talking to you guys about books, and having this sort of outlet to talk about books myself is always really fun, so thank you guys for following along on the journey. So thank you guys so much for watching. If you've read any of these, please let me know in the comments. I'd love to talk about them with you, and otherwise feel free to follow my channel, like this video, etc. And as always, have a lovely day. Bye.